We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 18th of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, we'll have a readout from the talks on Ukraine in Paris. Then we'll examine if the US is redefining soft power or destroying it completely. Plus,
I hope the lawyers talk about birthright, citizenship and slavery, because that's what it was all about.
We'll unpick that story and more in our roundup of the papers. We'll join our Paris bureau to see how France is stepping up its role in Europe's defence tech race. And then
I was a little overwhelmed by how many people trivialize this monumental moment for science.
Yep, we all laughed at the dire wolf story, but what actually is one? Andrew Muller will share what he learnt this week, and we'll find out on this Good Friday what the Pope's Easter plans are. And finally, do aliens exist? We'll hear about a new scientific discovery which suggests we may not be alone. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Hamas wants a comprehensive deal to end the war in Gaza and swap all Israeli hostages for Palestinians jailed in Israel. US strikes on a fuel port in Yemen killed at least 38 people on Thursday, one of the deadliest days since the United States began its attacks on the Iran-backed militants. And Donald Trump has signalled a potential end to the tit-for-tat tariff hikes between the US and China that shocked markets. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now let's check in with the talks that began yesterday in Paris. Foreign ministers from Britain, various EU countries and the United States gathered to discuss the situation and way forward in Ukraine. There was also a high-level delegation from Kyiv. Ahead of the meeting, Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia uses every day and every night to kill. Pressure must be applied to the killers. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Monocle's British-Ukrainian journalist Julia Lassica and by Florence Biederman, a journalist and French political analyst speaking to us from Paris. Julia, if we could start with you, those are very strong words from Zelensky. He also directly attacks Steve Witkoff, the US Middle East envoy. What else did he say? Is this a change in attitude, and was it prompted by a particular incident?
Yeah, of course. So good morning. Well, I think if we start with, is it a change in attitude? I don't think it is. I think that Zelensky has had very strong words for this US administration. Back in, during the sort of spat, the February Oval Office meeting spat, he actually talked about J.D. Vance also spreading Russian propaganda, which is what he accused Witkoff of doing last night. I think, has anything happened? I mean, the last few days in Ukraine have been really, really, really difficult. We saw the Palm Sunday attack in Sumy. The night before last, there was a young girl who was killed in Zaporizhia because a drone smashed into a building. Last night, there were also bombs dropped on residential buildings in Sumy, which was also attacked, on Sunday. And there's just a constant barrage. It's a very, very difficult situation now, and Ukraine feels more exposed than ever. So I think this is an anger that he's sort of showing. But it's interesting interesting that the reaction from the US administration hasn't been as strong as when, he accused J.D. Vance, and I think maybe even sort of alluded to Trump listening into Russian propaganda back in February. I think Witkoff's position is very, very difficult right now because, he was in Moscow on Sunday. He was there. And that's when, it happened. That's when Russia launched that horrific attack, which was condemned by everyone. And, Trump did sort of add these caveats. He said it might have been a mistake by Russia, but he did say, this was a horrific attack. So I think Witkoff's position is being very undermined right now by what's happening.
And of course, Witkoff came and sort of gave a report of that meeting with Putin. Florence, do we have a readout from the talks in Paris?
Well, no, there was no press conference. There is no readout. It was pretty discreet, but, it's diplomacy. So both sides, like at least the Americans and the French were happy with the discussions. But since it's diplomatic effort, you don't know that much, except that they were happy. And that there will be a follow-up talks in London. So it really seems that this process involving the Europeans in the talks, because so far they were really excluded. And those talks which brought together Americans and Ukrainians and Europeans at a high level, are the first talks of this kind. So it can mean somehow that the Americans realize the process with Putin is pretty stalled. Like he refused politely, but he refused the provisory ceasefire. So it seems they realize that the Europeans can have a role to play in those talks, which is good.
And the role particularly played by Macron. I mean, he seems to be leading the process. What would he like to see happen next?
Well, the talks continuing, and the Europeans would like the American administration to put more pressure on President Putin, to get a ceasefire. They have an experience with him, like there were a series of ceasefires in what was called the Minsk process, like to advance peace in Ukraine previously. And eventually, Russia never respected the ceasefire. So they have an experience on what it is to discuss with Vladimir Putin, and that can be useful if they share it with the United States, which so far has seemed to be much more lenient to Putin as they should be if they want to get a result in this war.
I mean, Julia, can Russia ever be an honest broker? And for that matter, can the US?
Yeah, I think that before, Trump came in, there was an understanding that the US was sort of trying to listen to Ukrainian positions. Russian disinformation is so widespread, propaganda, they've used so many different methods in which to get their message out into the world. So one of their big messages is that, people who are living in eastern Ukraine, people who are living in Crimea, they want to be with Russia. So that was something that Witkoff actually repeated back in this very infamous interview with Tucker Carlson on his podcast, in which he sort of was leaning back in his chair and soliloquizing about the sort of fate of Ukraine to be with Russia. So that massively undermined for the Ukrainians, can the US be an honest broker? Is this US administration? There is a feeling that Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio, they are much more pushing for a much more kind of rational position on Ukraine and Russia. They're kind of understanding the reality of the conflict, of the war, and of Russia. I mean, can they be an honest broker? They've broken the ceasefire 30 times, it's recorded, since it was sort of meant to be in place. And they're sort of relentlessly attacking civilian, very much, obviously exploiting, civilian objects, civilian targets. So that really undermines their position. And as Florence was saying, we saw the Minsk talks. They have no track record. We saw their track record in Syria, in Chechnya, in Georgia. They don't have a track record of keeping to promises. Any time that any sort of nation tries to make a promise with them, some sort of agreement, they sort of drag it out into these lengthy negotiations, which is what we can see happening with the US now. And slowly we can see sort of Trump's frustration, although nothing has really boiled over yet. So, no, I don't really think they can.
Yeah, I mean, Florence, how much do you think Washington is influenced by the Kremlin?
First of all, I think the word broker is not really appropriate, because they took the role of being the direct negotiation with Russia, If there was kind of a broker party, they would have included Ukraine or European in the talks. So it's just a kind of a power position where they think they are, kind of equal. That's the Trump vision, at least, equal, strong men, and that they are going to come to an agreement. So that's the way they envision the talks. But again, they realize now they reach a dead end, and they have to try maybe other venues. So let's see what comes in the end. Those talks are the first; they are not the last. I think we can still have months to come in discussions.
Yeah, it also seemed that the arrival of the Ukrainian delegation was a bit of a surprise for the US people, for Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff, Florence. Did the US want them excluded?
Yes, absolutely. First, Macron was supposed, President Macron, Emmanuel Macron, French president, was supposed to meet them. And it seems like he called, not hastily, but he called Europeans and also Ukrainians to come to the discussion. So whether it was really forced on the American, of course, they didn't refuse this. But again, this was kind of let's say clever moves. Let's admit, Macron can be really good on these things, to try to enlarge discussions. So it doesn't mean that it will have a strong influence, on the result, but definitely. Again, the presence of the Ukrainian at these talks was really important.
And just quickly before we go, Julia, we've heard that Ukraine and the US have signed a mineral deal. We're reporting this in our headlines. What more can you tell us about this? So
they've signed a memorandum of intent. There was this moment last night where I think it was Steve Bassett in Washington was signing it, and then a Ukrainian representative was signing it there, and it was being signed online. So it's just a memorandum of intent, and they've said that they want to sign the real deal next week. We know that it's been watered down. So at first, Trump was demanding $300 billion in return for, that US help throughout this war since 2022. And now that's been watered down to $100 billion. And we know that it's very much tied to peace talks. So we know that if Ukraine wants to keep the US interested in the process and interested in their engagement as well, then Ukraine very much has to sort of push on with this, make progress. We know that Ukraine has hired an international law firm to help them with this because it is an incredibly complex legal agreement which would actually give the US, we don't understand the details. And that's one of the frustrations for ordinary Ukrainians, is that this is being signed over their heads, but this will have, impact on Ukraine for generations to come. There is, so far, we don't know of a sort of end date to this agreement, and it would give the US control, supposedly, in the last sort of readout that we had, but we don't know any more details now. Control of Ukrainian railways, energy production, trade as well with the EU, which was a big sticking point. So I think there's a lot of frustration among ordinary Ukrainians. Why are the terms of this deal not being discussed? Are their lives and their children's and their grandchildren's lives being handed over to the US? And how much, and also one big sticking point is, are there any security guarantees? Are there any guarantees that if the US is economically involved in Ukraine, does that mean, will they hand over bits of territory to Russia as and when they feel like it? Will they do deals with Russia on Ukrainian territory? So it's very, very unclear. And I think there's a lot of frustration. Can there be some transparency in this process?
Julia Lassica, thank you very much. Thank you also to Florence Biederman in Paris. This is The Globalist. Now, at this time of great change in the United States, how is Washington's influence on the rest of the world changing? Well, to get an insight on this, I'm joined by Chris Lord, Monocle's executive editor. Chris, the US has for decades been very good at soft power, at cultural, diplomatic, ideological ways of really shaping global events. I wonder if that's now over. I mean, it was Hollywood and Harvard, and both of those, under the current Trump administration, are coming under fire.
You're right. Soft power has been absolutely intrinsic to the hegemony that America has managed to achieve over the course of the 20th century. And I think it's worth just sort of reminding ourselves a bit what soft power is. It's a theory, first of all. It began as a theory, this idea that countries can exert influence, can exert power in other ways than the hard power of gunboats and war and tariffs, as we now see, and all these ways. You can find ways to influence other countries to do what you want them to do through your culture and through your outreach or through your aid budget. Now, you raise two really important ones there. The first is education. So America, going back to its origins as this idea of a city on the hill, has been this place where people go to get a better life. And I think the Ivy League universities are almost the kind of engines of that idea, that you can come from wherever you are in the world, you can go to the absolute gold standard of education, which is Harvard and Yale and the like, go there and you suddenly become part of a idea of American excellence and almost a kind of certainly join an elite. I think that is obviously right now hugely under fire. This idea of removing the tax exemption status from Harvard, it's not surprised though. The people around Trump and the MAGA movement, their ire towards these institutions as embodiments of that elite idea that we were just talking about has been going right back from when Trump entered politics in 2016.
And indeed from when he had his own university, which was shut down by who? The Department of Education.
Absolutely. And another institution, another body that he's also took issue with and tried to shut down. So there is a long history of this idea, and it is about that elite notion. It's essentially that there are people, cultural influences in the old meaning of the word, those who had sort of elite status in these institutions who can decide who is in and who is out. So that's, I think, the big one. The second thing, and I think a little bit sidelined because this erosion has happened over quite a few years, is the decline of Hollywood as a major power. I was based in Los Angeles until November last year for 3 years. And that period, I saw with my own eyes the erosion of Hollywood, not just in LA as a force to create wealth and to draw people from all over the world who want to go and work there. Simply, it's just not got the money in it anymore like it used to, and it doesn't have the power, therefore, that it has. And also the films that it produces, a lot of those films now, it's become decentralized. You can make them much cheaper elsewhere. So the draw of California, as it traditionally was, has changed. It's become a lot more about tech and about venture capital. And even that idea we can talk about as well. The kind of idea of the dream of California has slightly been marred by some of the politics that have happened there and the effect that's had on some of the cities. But I think there is this feeling, that America, as part of this idea that it no longer needs to protect the world in hard power, also, I think the MAGA view is America also doesn't need to really put its worldview out there either, because it's just right. And we don't need to convince anybody of it anymore.
Yeah. I wonder, though, if we could say that its soft power is being dismantled, or is it just being recalibrated? Do different things matter?
Yeah, look, I think that all this soft power stuff costs money. That's the big thing. And the Trump promise is that his sort of pact, if you like, with his voters. He said, look, if you bring me in, I will rein in the spending and I'll redistribute it amongst us. It's America first. So that we have to remember that here. If you're spending, and the big one that we've seen happen in the last few months, we're only 100 days into this administration, US aid is gone as it once was. That is a profound change in America's idea of what role it plays in the world. Forget just as a protector in a military sense, also funding programs around the world. It just no longer sees that as valuable. And I think while you can see this as a MAGA phenomenon and something that comes with Donald Trump, actually being on the ground there in America, you talk to a lot of people there. Georgina, you know as well as I do. You travel around parts of America, there's healthcare you've got to pay for. Schools are expensive and not very good, and the state system is underfunded. You go to infrastructure and half of it's falling apart. The airports are falling apart. The rail system is overpriced and doesn't work very well. If you're an American, which is not a low tax country, let's be clear. Even if you're in somewhere like Florida, which doesn't charge any state tax, for example, your federal tax is still relatively high for a lot of people who, rightly or wrongly, feel they don't get a lot of bang for that buck, for all that money that they spend. So the Trump promise is, let's roll back all this stuff that costs us money internationally, get rid of the US aid, we bring down the federal budget, and therefore we can essentially bring taxes down and whatever that might be. The fact of the matter is that American power, in the broader sense, has been built on soft power, as in it was done with some clever thinking in mind, which was bring more investment to the US, bring people to come and want to go and work there, bring the brightest and the best. We talked about education before. Bring them through the Ivy League system to enrich the country. And this is going to be the consequence of a lot of this stuff, is that you're going to see a leakage of people thinking, well, where am I going to put myself? Where do I want to be? And finally, Georgina, all I'll say is, look at right here where we are right now in Britain. When Britain voted to leave the European Union, the challenge, what came with that, wasn't just about the red tape and the changing of sort of tariff regimes with Europe. All that stuff is economic. What it also did, it put an image out to the world that Britain wasn't open anymore. And what that does, it cuts off the flow of the brightest and the best and investment into the country. Britain is now still trying to recover from that, and I think America has just embarked on that process.
And so who steps up? Is it China?
China, look, this is a really interesting question, because China worked out a long time ago that when it wanted to be the world's preeminent power, it said, we're also going to have to invest in soft power. What did they do? Well, they gave out big development loans, would be a big one. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially this idea of creating trade routes all over the world by investing in our infrastructure in countries from the Caribbean and South America and Central America, and saying to people, we'll build you roads and rail, but you're going to be plugged into our system and it's going to be a whole big system of trade. That was their soft power. It was also an element of, building sports stadiums in African nations or building libraries in far-flung places. This was a sort of idea of soft power. And again, that was very predicated on China having abundant money. Well, it doesn't have abundant money anymore, certainly not the growth like it did. It's still a very, very wealthy country. But you have a population who, just like Americans, feel they don't get a lot of bang for their buck. They want to see that money being spent right and being able to create the kind of growth that it used to do. But I do think that we're in a very, very fractious moment. And I don't have the answer about whether China can step in here because culturally, I think they've still got a huge barrier to overcome to create the kind of hegemony that America existed in the 20th century. They, just on the basic level in terms of the English-speaking world is vast, and that's who America could speak to and so on. But I think also China, a lot of people are very wary of China, and that wariness indeed has come to America as well. I think actually, when we think of a soft power now, you slightly have to look to slightly sort of second-tier countries a little bit in terms of power and wealth. You think of places like Mexico, for example, which has built an incredible industrial base. Weirdly, you even look to places like we saw this week, El Salvador. And this is a soft power that none of us could here in Britain could maybe understand. But you go around parts of Latin America which are struggling with extraordinary levels of crime right now, and they look at what Nayib Bukele has done in Salvador, and they say in places like Ecuador or Peru, we would like our own Bukele. We would look at the Salvadorian example. What we see is mega jails. What they see is security. So I think what has happened, the idea of a singular soft power, which is about democracy, freedom, liberalism, all that kind of stuff, is being dismantled as we speak. And actually what you're going to probably get to is a much more fragmented idea of soft power, where smaller players regionally say, we've got the answer to your problems.
Chris Lord, thank you. Now, still to come on the programme.
We learned that neither President Trump nor his Salvadoran counterpart, President Nayib Bukele, are able between them to put one guy on a plane.
Andrew Muller on What We Learned. This is The Globalist.
IQ, EQ and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
It is 8:23 in Zurich, 7:23 here in London. And let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Theo Usherwood, a political journalist and broadcaster. Good morning to you, Theo.
Very good morning to you, Judy.
Let's start with this story out of the US. This is the New York Times version of it, that the Supreme Court is to hear arguments to end birthright citizenship.
Yes, you'll remember, of course, that this was an executive order signed by Donald Trump in his first few hours in office, which basically removed the right to claim birthright citizenship for all undocumented migrants and foreign residents. It caused uproar. And then there was an immediate pause. There was an order which put a pause on that executive order, and now it's gone up all the way up to the Supreme Court. And if there'd been any expectation that this might be kicked into the proverbial long grass, that this would be something that the justices wouldn't consider in the immediate term and it would just sort of linger there, forget it. The Supreme Court have now said in a written notice yesterday, which they didn't sign, and apparently the New York Times is saying that's typical. They didn't give a reasoning, I should say. It was unsigned as well, which the New York Times says is typical in these cases. They've said that they want to start hearing oral arguments on May the 15th. Now, the pause is going to, on the order which was put in place, is going to remain so. And so, of course, if you're an undocumented migrant and one of your children, and you have a child that is born in the United States, they will still be able to claim citizenship as usual. But it does, I think, give an indication as to the desire of the Supreme Court to expedite the hearing in this regard and to come to a decision as to whether that original executive order from Donald Trump in the first day of office is going to stand.
And of course, this comes off the back of these emergency applications about the people deported to El Salvador.
Yeah. Yes, and of course, you're quite right to, of course, mention that. And I think in Europe, obviously, a lot of the focus has been on tariffs and the impact of Donald Trump's trade war. But it's worth always remembering, keeping in the back of your mind, and this is why I picked out this particular story, the effect of Donald Trump domestically as well, and particularly around the rights of immigration. We had that man who was deported wrongly to El Salvador, and the impact that's having domestically in the United States, and that's why I picked out this particular story, because I think we can always, in Europe, we can think about the tariffs that are being imposed, the impact on China, look at Donald Trump's impact internationally, but domestically it's huge as well.
Yeah, well, internationally they've got involved in Somalia because the US and Somalia have carried out an airstrike against al-Shabaab. Tell us more about this.
Yes, this was an airstrike in a town north of Mogadishu called Adan Yabal, which is Mogadishu, the capital, and it happened yesterday among 12 militants from al-Shabaab, which is the Islamist terrorist group which controls much of central and southern Somalia. 12 militants from that group were reportedly killed, and of course the group does have links to Al-Qaeda as well, and it follows a resurgence of the jihadist group, including a targeted attack on President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed's convoy. He is, of course, as the leader of the country, he controls or like to control the entirety of Somalia. But for many years now, al-Shabaab has operated in Somalia. And this is an important story. I know a lot of the focus is always on the Middle East and the conflict in Gaza, and war between Israel and Hezbollah and Hamas. But Somalia has become, in years gone by, and continues to be a hotbed for Islamist terrorism. And many of our, in the UK and in Europe, are very wary that if, as a country, it falls completely to al-Shabaab, or al-Shabaab isn't at least kept in check, then what you have is it can act as a feeding ground, as a nursery for terrorists who want to come to Europe, who want to come to the UK. They can go out to Somalia, they can train, and then they can export their terrorism to Europe, travel north and export their terrorism to Europe. And that's why the United States, particularly as well, is very keen to work with the Somali government to ensure that al-Shabaab does not maintain a foothold in that country. But going by this story and the way the BBC is reporting it is actually this comes after al-Shabaab taken the town and is making significant gains within Somalia.
Very, very interesting, and one obviously we're going to have to follow. Tragic news from Italy.
Yes, 4 people have died and 1 is seriously injured after a cable car crashed, and this is in The Guardian, I should say, to the ground near Naples in southern Italy on Thursday. The accident happened at, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Montefiato, which is a peak 28 miles to the southeast of Naples. The Italian media are reporting apparently that one of the cables supporting the cabin had snapped. Separately, 16 passengers were helped out of a cabin that stopped mid-air near the foot of the mountain. This is another tragedy, and of course it comes off what happened in 2021. 14 people died when a cable car linking Lake Maggiore with a nearby mountain plunged to the ground in northern Italy. And I'm sure many people, booking our summer holidays, you want to travel to the Alps or Italy, and cable cars are a fantastic way, if you're not in peak physical fitness, whether you have young children or you're taking granny or grandpa with you on holiday, to get to the top of a mountain, to witness the fantastic views that are on offer, whether they be in Italy or France, and to enjoy the scenery. And of course, many people, this is an awful tragedy, but people, I'm sure, will be starting to be conscious about whether cable cars are the best way to do it. Of course, you can't. I did once try to drive to the top of a mountain in Lanzarote, and it is absolutely chaos when you have these very windy roads going up the mountain. There's usually a precipice on one side, and you try to drive up the mountain. Cable cars should be much more the preferable option.
Yeah, but terrifying.
Yeah.
Thought of it. Very quickly, bad news for brown bears in Romania.
Well, yes, I read this story, and apparently the population of brown bears in Romania has actually gone up higher than previously thought. Now, it had been expected that there had been 8,000, previously estimated 8,000 brown bears in Romania. I didn't know, I'm going to declare my ignorance here, I didn't know that Romania was such a home to the brown bears.
I'm shocked at your lack of knowledge of the specialist subject.
But 13,000, Euronews is reporting now that there are 13,000 bears living in the country. And this was a study conducted by Romania's Forestry Research Institute. However, apparently they did have some scepticism about the way that the research was conducted and whether actually this was an accurate census of the bears.
But what they're saying now is that they want to cull them.
Yes. Well, I don't know if that's... I don't know if that's... I mean, yeah, we've seen it in... I mean, I go to Richmond Park in London, to southwest of London, very often. They're always culling the deers there. And I always thought that bears were endangered, but I suppose they can be quite dangerous. And if Romania is trying to woo tourists, then it could be we could have more tragedies where the bears corner a particular tourist. But having been fortunate enough to see bears in a mother bear and her cubs in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming in the United States, they are fantastic. They're incredible animals, and I would recommend going to see a bear, but I would not recommend being cornered by a bear, and I hope that the bear population survives.
Thank you for that Ursine advice. Thea Usherwood, many thanks for coming in. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Hamas wants a comprehensive deal to end the war in Gaza and to swap all Israeli hostages for Palestinians jailed in Israel, a senior official from the Palestinian militant group said, rejecting Israel's offer of an interim truce. In a televised speech, the leader of the negotiating team said the group would no longer agree to interim deals, adopting a position that Israel is unlikely to accept and potentially further delaying an end to the devastating attacks that restarted in recent weeks. US strikes on a fuel port in Yemen killed at least 38 people on Thursday, Houthi-run media said, one of the deadliest days since the United States began its attacks on the Iran-backed militants. The US has vowed not to halt the large-scale strikes begun last month in its biggest military operation in the Middle East since President Donald Trump took office in January, unless the Houthis cease attacks on Red Sea shipping. And Donald Trump has signalled a potential end to the tit-for-tat tariff hikes between the US and China that shocked markets, and said that a deal over the fate of social media platform TikTok may have to wait. Trump's comments further pointed to a diminished appetite for sharply higher across-the-board tariffs on dozens of countries after markets reacted violently to their introduction on April the 2nd. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now for a look behind the headlines. Here's Monocle's Paris bureau chief, Simon Bouvier, on how France is stepping up its role in Europe's defence tech race.
It can sound like European policymakers are constantly lamenting the continent's lack of a competitive defence industry these days. But when it comes to radars, the engineers over at French defence firm Thales beg to differ. The company says its latest air surveillance and defense radar, the Groundfire 300, can simultaneously detect and track up to 1,000 airborne targets, including drone swarms and hypersonic missiles. Thales' marketing and strategy director, Éric Marceau, told French business daily Les Echos that the system's capabilities are now clearly superior to those of the American Patriot that all European countries buy. With NATO estimating Europe needs to increase its air defense capacity fivefold and US engagement on the continent in question, Thales has already significantly stepped up its air defense radar production in Limours, southwest of Paris. With 400 hires last year, a further 400 planned for this year, the electronics specialist has already tripled its air defense radar output in the past 3 years and plans to keep ramping it up. At a time of intense hand-wringing on security issues, Thales' swaggering challenge to presumed US supremacy in cutting-edge defense tech is a much-needed tonic for European self-doubt.
That was Simon Bouvier, our Paris bureau chief. And for more from Monocle's editors and correspondents around the world, do sign up for our free daily newsletter at monocle.com/minute. Earlier this month, scientists announced the return of the dire wolf, a species that vanished more than 12,000 years ago and found pop culture fame thanks to Game of Thrones. The news broke on the covers of Time, The New Yorker and Rolling Stone magazines before making headlines around the world. At the centre of it all is Ben Lamm, CEO and co-founder of Colossal Biosciences, a company working to bring back extinct species like the woolly mammoth and the dodo. Monocle's Laura Kramer caught up with Ben to talk about the science behind the breakthrough, what it means for conservation, and what it was like seeing their direwolf, Ramus, on the cover of Time.
Personally, as a kid, well, in my grandfather, my poppy's office, he had a photo of me and a photo of him together on the cover and had a mock photo of us on Time. And so it's kind of, for me personally, I just don't know, and this is respecting all media out there. I know there's a lot of great media out there, but Time is truly timeless. And to have a picture of Remus on the cover of Time, alluding to the importance of these technologies for conservation, I mean, I don't know if there's anything that can really top that. One of the things that was really wonderful was that Time Magazine, Rolling Stone, and The New Yorker, we didn't go out super wide with this to begin. And obviously that changed very quickly. But, you know, they spent a lot of time with us. They saw the wolves. They spent time with our team. You know, they probably spent, it feels like on our side, we spent 100 hours with them. And so I feel like they really understood the importance of the work, scientific achievement, which is like the equivalent of the moon landing for genetics. And I feel like they really understood what it meant for conservation. We had no idea it was going to be a cover. And I think it's truly remarkable, not just for Colossal, but for science, right? It's like we see a lot of cover stories right now, and we get sold a lot of, and I'm not just saying just with Time, but a lot of, you know, we've got tariff wars, we've got chip wars, we've got AI wars, we've got all this like negative hope. And so for like a kid or a parent to like look at a trusted magazine like Time and see the potential of synthetic biology made real, it was a really moving experience.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm sure throughout all this, you've seen a whole plethora of different reactions from people. Has anything really surprised you, actually? Because I'm assuming you were prepared for the ethics questions. You were prepared for how is the science? And, you know, shouldn't this be better spent elsewhere? But has there been a reaction that actually you weren't prepared for? They're like, oh, this is weird. I didn't think this would happen.
Well, I think my three surprises are the first on the money should be spent on conservation. We completely agree. That's why we stood up our $50 million foundation that just funds conservation. And all of our technologies are free for conservation, right? And so, people are very busy. And so I don't expect them to go know everything about Colossal. They just hear people make dire wolves and they're like, oh my gosh, but wolves are in trouble. Why aren't we saving wolves? That's a fair assessment. The two things I was surprised about was there's 15 red wolves left in the wild. Now there's more than 100 in captive breeding programs, but still from only 12 genetic lines. I was surprised that everyone in the world wasn't excited that, oh my gosh, they made more red wolves than they did dire wolves. And I was surprised that our poor little red wolves didn't get the same limelight, because they're not cast in movies and TV shows, right? So that was one surprise. That was surprise number one. And the only other surprise was, the women and men at Colossal have done something no one else has ever done. There's ancient genes that have been lost for 12,000 years back in the closest living relative to the dire wolf, right? But I was a little overwhelmed by how many people trivialize this monumental moment for science and wanted to just argue taxonomy classification. And so it's a weird argument because I think that there's 31 ways to classify a species. And my argument is like, if you want to call it a dire wolf, great. If you want to call it the colossal dire wolf, great. If you want to call it a the most genetically modified wolf in the world, great. Like whatever makes you happy. But let's not lose sight of the importance of conservation and of the importance of the technologies. This is a monumental step in genome engineering. And I hate that the semantic argument became a focus over the importance of scientific process.
So what are the wolves up to then? Are there going to be more?
It's a great question. So we've got Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi. But yeah, they are in their ecological preserve. They're doing well. We will make another few. I think our goal is to get to kind of a 5 to 8 total pack size. And then we'll continually study them behaviorally. They're now behaving more and more like traditional wolves, which is great. And then, over time, then just based on conversations we have with some of our indigenous partners and others, we'd love to rewild them back in areas where they're wanted. That's far away from like cattle or anything that could be a conflict. And several of our indigenous people groups are pretty interested in having them due to the kind of the ancestral nature of them. So, yeah.
That was Ben Lamm in conversation with Monocle's Laura Kramer. You're with Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist, and as it's Friday, it's time for Andrew Muller's weekly news roundup. What we learned.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We learned this week that the gazillions amassed by Amazon proprietor and reason your new vacuum cleaner is in your neighbour's hedge, Jeff Bezos, had enabled him to enact what must rank high among the two most common human fantasies, i.e. the launching of one's paramour and or an annoying pop singer into space.
Liftoff for a group of 6 women, including a pop star, a TV presenter and a scientist.
But then they came back. Aww. You can't have everything, not even, apparently, if you own the shop which sells everything. We learned, however, that the whole enterprise had not been a complete waste of whatever amount Bezos set light to in underwriting this point-free joyride, for we learned that dispatching thinkers of the caliber of Harley's in Hawaii hitmaker Katy Perry to the Carmen line had yielded philosophical insights easily fit to be rendered in florid typeface and pinned up as a poster on the wall of the sort of cafe that boasts deliberately mismatched furniture and a menu with smiley faces in the dots over the eyes.
We weren't just taking up space, we were making space.
Which makes a change from wasting it, am I right? We learned, however, that Bezos was not the only American mogul frittering his fortune on dubious simulacra of the real thing. We learned that some digging had been done into the provenance of the mysterious array of gold trophies which has descended upon US President Donald Trump's Oval Office mantelpiece in recent weeks, and that they are not, as had been widely and understandably assumed, self-awarded golf cups and Nobel Peace Prizes, but gilded tchotchkes which give every appearance of having been sourced from
China.
Specifically from Guangzhou Home Max Decorative Material Limited, which knocks this stuff out on Alibaba as high-density home decoration polyurethane appliques ornament PU foam veneer accessories at about $5 a go.
Minimum order 50 pieces.
We learned, however, or at least gleaned, that their presence in the Oval Office now means that Trump got in ahead of the tariffs, out of the deal right there.
I think this.
But we learned that they were dismally, appropriately bogus background to a conclave of the kind of hapless demagogues who can't even at least get the trains to run on time. For we learned that being a preening authoritarian is less straightforward than it may appear.
I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay. Tell me more.
Let's see where this goes.
We learned that neither President Trump nor his Salvadoran counterpart, President Nayib Bukele, are able between them to put one guy on a plane.
Can President Bukele weigh in on this? Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm supposed to not suggesting that I smuggle terrorists into the United States, right?
We learned that the one guy in question, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who even the US administration admits was shipped to its Central American gulag as a consequence of administrative error, would not be coming home, as we learned that the US administration was determined to double down on its evidence. And mathematicians among our listeners will know what you get when you double nothing.
So he went back to his home country where he will face consequences for his gang affiliation and his engagement in human trafficking. I'm not sure what is so difficult about this for everyone in the media to understand.
We are in the media maybe not as smart as Caroline Levitt, but we do understand that in the absence of any due process, Mr. Garcia has been engaged in human trafficking only inasmuch as he is a victim of it. But we learned that one of 21st century American conservatism's foremost thinkers, this is tragically a statement of fact, i.e. querulous Fox News mannequin Jesse Waters, had uncovered, with a flourish worthy of Columbo, the proof.
Garcia's a Bulls fan, but he's from El Salvador, and he lives in Maryland, not Chicago. The Bulls lost 60 games in 2019, so why the hat? Can Garcia name anyone on the team? Anyone on any Bulls team besides Jordan? Everyone from El Salvador knows what it means when you wear a Bulls hat.
Yes, we learned that anybody who supports any sports team based outside the immediate jurisdiction in which they were raised or now live is prima facie a dangerous criminal, and look therefore forward to the deportation of the hefty and noisy contingent of Manchester United and Liverpool supporters at large in London and indeed the wider home counties. This is not a sarcastic absurdism, we're genuinely into it. And cue big head, large bloused, bad in the 80s lone hit irritants flock of seagulls. Because, sticking with the subject of testy marauders apparently wrecking institutions for the sake of it, for those struggling to keep up, this is a wry segue calling back to President Trump.
I see.
I get it now.
Righto, carry on.
We learned of the anarchist tendencies of the seagull. Yes, we learned that one such creature, so not actually a flock, but whatever, had forced the temporary closure of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University by breaking a panel in its expensive glass roof by repeatedly dropping a rock on it. Please enjoy this verite audio of a seagull repeatedly dropping a rock on the expensive glass roof of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. We learned that boffins prevailed upon to explain this apparently gratuitous vandalism were insistent that it was consistent with such observed seagull behaviour as banging shellfish against hard surfaces to get at the contents, and were therefore failing to consider that maybe this particular seabird was acting with malevolent intent, seabird with malevolent intent, right, and was therefore a turn for the worse. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mullett.
Thank you, Andrew. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
Each of us has a craft, a calling that inspires us. Whether it's how a coffee is brewed, a chair is built, or how money is looked after. There's a love for the work, a care that compels you forward. For us at UBS, it's about designing a unique outcome for you. Because whatever your craft may be, ours is built around helping you succeed. UBS. Banking is our craft.
It is Good Friday today, the beginning of the Christian religious festival of Easter, which will be commemorated in churches all over the world, perhaps nowhere more so than at the Vatican in Rome, the spiritual home of Catholicism and the physical home of His Holiness, the Pope. Well, joining me now, Juliet Linley, who's a journalist and broadcaster and former Vatican correspondent. Juliet, I understand you were in Rome yesterday. How was it and how are they preparing for Easter?
There's a lot of preparations underway, and of course, on everyone is wondering, on everyone's mind is, will we or will we not see the Pope on Easter Sunday or today being Good Friday, which marks the day that Jesus was crucified. And there is always every year near the Colosseum a recreation of Jesus's steps before crucifixion, known as the Stations of the Cross, the Via Crucis. So many people I was talking to near the Vatican were saying, will we see the Pope? Now, this is the busiest week of the year usually for a Pope, but he is on a 2-month rest and recuperation convalescence, Georgina. He is 88 years old. He was in hospital for 38 days. So the Vatican itself is not saying which events or liturgies he will attend, if any. However, this is a Pope of unexpected appearances. And even just yesterday evening, usually the Pope would have said Mass at a detention facility or at a prison. No one expected him to turn up. He turned up at Rome's historic Regina Coeli prison, met 70 inmates, did not say Mass, however, spent 30 minutes there meeting prisoners and talking to them. And so, of course, Georgina, let's see what happens tonight at the Stations of the Cross and even on Sunday, on Easter Sunday. Maybe he will at least turn up to give the traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing on Sunday. Now, Georgina, this is the Pope very much, let's say, putting into practice what he often says, which is he is now confined to a wheelchair, but he always says you don't need legs to govern, you need a head. And he keeps on showing the world that he is indeed very present. As you remember, he even just met King Charles and Camilla unexpectedly at the Vatican when they were in Rome just last week.
And Juliet, very quickly, can you tell us about the Pope auction? And here we should make it clear that it's not actually His Holiness going under the hammer, but an object of significance to him.
It's a white silk papal skull cap known as a zucchetto that he himself wore, and he has autographed it. And it could be yours, Georgina, if you are willing to fork out. They're hoping for around $40,000 for it. It's going under the hammer on the Katawiki online auction platform for collectibles. And it has a certificate of authenticity signed by Francis's personal secretary. And here's the thing. This isn't the first time that papal items go under the hammer. Last year, for €45,000, someone bid on a guitar that was gifted by music legend B.B. King to Pope St. John Paul II, And all of this comes under the name of supporting educational and social projects and promoting cultural initiatives in disadvantaged communities that are overseen by a non-profit, which is called the History Life Onless.
Juliet, thank you very much and happy Easter. That's Juliet Linley there joining us from Tuscany. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Astronomers have found the strongest hints yet of life beyond our solar system. It's an astounding discovery made possible by the James Webb Space Telescope. Well, I'm joined in the studio now by the author and science writer, David Bodanis, to tell us more. David, tell us what's been discovered.
They discovered signs of a sort of a gas in the atmosphere of a planet, not just an ordinary planet, but a planet similar in size to Earth, not too close to the sun that it's boiling hot, not too far from its sun that it's freezing cold. So it's a planet that seems to have liquid water on it, decent temperatures and stuff. And there's some things you might find in a distant planet which could just come from rocks, like carbon dioxide can float off from rocks. But the particular chemical they found there, we're unaware of any way it could be created other than biology.
That's extraordinary. Just unpack the science behind that for me, though.
Oh, so the way that we tell what it is, suppose you, at night, you're trying to tell if there's a piano or not, I don't know, down the street, and you hear the sounds of certain chords. So you'll know, oh, I see, there's a distance between, like, I don't know, the C and the E or the C and the F. So you can work out the distance between, like, the different sounds that are being produced, and you can kind of create the shape of the piano. So we do the same thing with signatures that come from distant planets of the distances that certain radiation comes out of atoms. So we can work out the shape of the atoms and work out these molecules that come from life. What I'm excited about is what similarities or differences would there be?
And tell us.
Well, if you look at something like the beautiful Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, if they have bridges on their planet, we'll call it Planet George. If they have bridges on Planet George, they would look like the Golden Gate Bridge because gravity is the same everywhere. If they have languages, it would be quite different from ours.
And so, are you talking about a sort of mirror reality?
So here's the other question about timing. The universe has been around for, as Douglas Adams would say, an incredibly long time. It's extremely unlikely we would get a snapshot of civilization right now, if indeed there is civilization. If somebody were to take a snapshot of Earth at random times over the last few billion years and few billion years in the future, most of the time they get bacteria. Other times they might get like nuclear waste. There might be just a brief interval where they'll get like sophisticated advanced people like the Trump family in their seventh generation running the United States.
I see. Look, how does this impact on our lives here? Why does it matter?
If religions took it seriously, it would raise the question about unique statements to our religions. So some of the syncretic religions, Buddhism would incorporate it really well. Certain other religions would have a problem. If there was a particular prophet on earth or a religious figure, and a divine force funneled in to someone on Earth, would that divine force have funneled into similar people in other places? The other question is, we don't feel that animals have the same understanding we do, and we have sensitivity and kindness towards children or mentally handicapped adults. So what level of being is one that's considered like appropriate to share our understanding? It raises those terrific questions. Another question it raises is self-defense. Whenever I've discussed this with American astronomers, they say, how lovely, we should tell them where we are. When I discuss it with European astronomers, they say, hide, do not let them find us.
How far away is this planet?
If you were to travel the speed of light, which I don't recommend, it would be about 350 years.
Wow. So, we're not going to visit it anytime soon.
It turns out there's a twist. It turns out that if you go really, 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 really fast, can I emphasize the really, time seems to slow down for you. So if we had rockets, unlike the rockets we had now, but in theory, by basic Einsteinian physics, we could actually get there. Somebody watching, sitting around on Earth might say, whoa, it's taken a long time. But for you yourself, it just might be a few hours. But that's rockets of an incredible sort that we don't yet have.
That's extraordinary.
I know.
So just before we go, I really want to get to the bottom of exactly what this means chemically. So what you're saying is that this planet could possibly support life?
Yes. So it seems at the right temperature, they call it the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold. Yeah, they always say it with a sing-song. I don't know why they say it like that. And we know there's liquid water on it. And the temperature's right, and the sun is kind of stable, and it's been orbiting for a very long time, kind of like our Earth. It seems that on our Earth, the moment the Earth cooled off, there are signs that bacteria and life forms and DNA got started almost straight away. So who knows?
And these are produced almost exclusively by living organisms, marine microbes.
Yeah, so on Earth, they're only produced by living organisms. And in fact, our scientists can't work out any way that this is produced by any other chemical reaction. I think it was at Cambridge, the main one of the main astronomers was. And they had these results about a year ago. And they spent a year really trying to find out, speaking to experts, is there some other way, some mixture of chemicals floating around that could that could produce this. Nobody could find such a thing. By the way, the particular smell is similar to the smell of our oceans. That fresh air smell that you get from our oceans is what is produced by this molecule.
How on earth do we know what it smells like? We haven't been to the planet.
So that's the great thing. So without having seen a piano that's maybe a block or 2 or 3 blocks away, by listening to the chords, we can work out the shape of the piano. So we were able to work out the shape of this molecule. And there's only like 92 main atoms around in the Earth. So they can work out, you can actually reconstruct a little model. For example, if you heard some neighbors yelling at each other, or acting out a play, you could create that same play in your own house. So we've actually made models of this, and we know exactly what it looks like. And it's exactly like the things in our oceans.
That's extraordinary. David Badanas, thank you very much indeed. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Monica Lillis, Laura Kramer and Chris Chermak, our researcher Francesca Gilks and our studio manager Steph Chungu, with editing assistance from Mariella Bevan, Flynn Simons and Hunter Wang. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing is live at midday in London. And the Globalists will return at the same time on Monday. I'll be with you tomorrow for Monocle on Saturday. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.